Let me tell you about Firebase Kestrel. Firebase Kestrel was a human installation, Terran Expeditionary Force, 3rd Combined Arms Brigade, established on a rocky ridge approximately 40 kilometers from the primary Velthari garrison complex. It had been there for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of setting up, digging in, running patrols in the frozen twilight, swearing at the wind, complaining about the rations, and waiting for something to happen. 6 weeks is a long time to wait. Humans are not, as a general rule, good at waiting. We tolerate it. We find ways to fill the time: card games, argument, obsessive equipment maintenance, the elaborate social hierarchy of boredom that any group of soldiers develops when they're confined together for extended periods. We get restless. We get testy. We start looking for things to do. The 3rd Combined Arms Brigade, TCA-3, as everyone called them, was 6 weeks deep into that particular species of institutionalized restlessness. They had approximately 3,800 combat personnel, organized into 6 ground assault battalions, 2 armored cavalry units equipped with Terran Mark IX Thunderhide main battle tanks, a dedicated artillery regiment operating 12 Helix-class mobile artillery platforms, 4 aerospace fighter squadrons, a rapid response airborne battalion, a combat engineering company, a full medical battalion, an intelligence company, and a signals regiment. If you're not a military person, some of that might not mean much to you. Let me translate. The Thunderhide tanks were, individually, machines that weighed approximately 90 metric tons, moved at 60 kilometers per hour across open terrain, carried a main gun that could punch through the primary hull of a Julari destroyer-class vessel if you hit it in the right place, and were operated by 2-person crews who had been training together for years and knew each other the way only people who have sat in small metal boxes together and kept each other alive tend to know anyone. The Helix artillery platforms could hurl precision-guided munitions across a range of 140 kilometers. They could do this continuously, rotating through a fire mission queue, maintaining sustained fire support across multiple engagements simultaneously. The crews referred to this capability, in the particular deadpan that artillery soldiers everywhere seem to share regardless of species, as politely discouraging the enemy from further advance. The aerospace fighters, specifically, the Terran F-91 Valkyrie, which had replaced the older F-88 in the TCA-3's organic aviation assets, were atmospheric/exo-atmospheric dual-role craft, meaning they could fight in the thin, brutal atmosphere of Carindel 7, and they could fight in the orbital space above it, meaning they were relevant regardless of whether the Julari tried to come down from above or push across the surface. And the airborne battalion, the 7th Rapid, they were called, formerly the 7th Rapid Response Airborne Battalion, could load into their heavy-lift assault craft and be anywhere on the accessible surface of Carindel 7 within 40 minutes. 40 minutes. All of this sitting 40 kilometers away from a Velthari garrison that was watching an assault fleet descend toward them. Here's where I need to tell you about Mara Chen. Brigadier General Mara Chen was 53 years old at the time of Carindel 7. She had spent 31 of those years in the Terran military, working her way up through every rank in the ground forces with the kind of methodical, relentless competence that tends to either get you killed early or get you eventually to the point where other people give you significant responsibility and then try to stay out of your way. She was not a large person. This comes up because people who know her by reputation sometimes expect someone physically imposing, and then they meet her and recalibrate. She was compact, with the kind of quiet stillness that very experienced soldiers develop, the ability to be completely motionless, completely present, conserving energy, watching everything, a stillness that somehow communicates more authority than any amount of physical size could. She had silver-streaked hair cut practically short, dark eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that, when she chose to use it in the full weight of command, had reportedly stopped an armored battalion in its tracks from 800 meters away. Her people loved her. Not in the performative way, not the way soldiers sometimes claim to love commanders because it's expected. In the way you love someone who has, on multiple occasions, stood between you and the thing that was trying to kill you. She was reviewing the defensive perimeter layout for Firebase Kestrel. Specifically, she was concerned about a gap in the sensor coverage on the northeastern approach, which the wind interference was making worse, when her signals officer appeared in the doorway of her command module. "General, talk to me, Reeves." Reeves was Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Reeves, Signals Regiment commander, and she had a tablet in her hand that she was holding with both hands, which Mara Chen noticed immediately, because Reeves didn't hold things with both hands when they were routine. Vilthari Garrison has sent a distress signal on the compact relay. 47-vessel Dulari assault package has arrived in system and is moving on their position. They are requesting any available backup. Chen said, "What does the compact relay say?" "Compact says it's assessing available assets. Stand by." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the command module, she could hear the wind doing what the wind always did on Carindel 7, which was scream. The walls flexed slightly with the pressure. The sensors above the module registered -114 and sustained winds at 230 kilometers per hour at the ridge elevation. "We're the closest asset," Reeves said, not pushing, stating. "By how much?" "Nearest compact naval response is 11 standard hours at maximum FTL burn. Nearest additional ground forces are 8 hours behind that." And the garrison's assessment. Their duty officer logged it as critical. 47 vessels, including a siege carrier. Garrison is primarily logistics and comms. Combat elements are under strength. Their estimate of time to contact is 40 minutes to initial landing forces, 2 hours to full surface assault. 2 hours. 11 hours for compact response. Chen set down her pen. She looked at the northeastern approach layout. She thought about the gap in the sensor coverage, and then she thought about the 4,000 Vilthari on the other side of 40 kilometers of frozen hell, and she thought about what 2 hours meant against 11. She picked up her field radio. "Get me all battalion commanders. Get me air group. Get me artillery. 15 minutes, command tent." Reeves started to leave. "Reeves." "General, tell the relay we're moving. We're not waiting for an assessment." "I've read the transcript of that briefing. It's part of the official compact inquiry record now, and every military academy in the compact has a copy of it, and when I read it I'm struck every time by how short it is. How simple. How utterly without drama, at least on the surface." Because what Chen had assembled in that command tent were the people responsible for 3,800 human soldiers. They were tired. Everyone was always tired on Carindel 7, and they'd been woken from sleep rotation or pulled from maintenance duty or interrupted in the middle of whatever the long specific boredom of a frozen moon posting had led them to. And they sat there in the command tent in the blue-white light of the emergency panels, while the wind screamed outside, and their general told them what was happening. The Vilthari garrison at Carindel, Maine is under assault. 47 Dulari vessels, including a siege carrier. Garrison is not capable of independent defense. Compact response is 11 hours out. We are 40 kilometers away. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "We are going to move. All units. Full combat load. I want the Thunderhides rolling in 20 minutes. I want artillery breaking down and mobile in 30. I want the 7th Rapid loaded and airborne in 15. Air group, you're going up now. I need orbital and upper atmosphere coverage. I need the Dulari landing forces to know there's air defense before they're 50% through their descent sequence." Questions. Not a question, a statement with a pause built in. Colonel Hector Fuentes, commanding the armored cavalry, said, "Row clearance for Julari contact. We're defending a compact installation. We're within existing rules of engagement." The siege carrier. "Don't make me answer a question about the siege carrier right now, Hector." Fuentes looked at the table. He wasn't uncomfortable, he was suppressing something. Relief, maybe. "Yes, ma'am." Lieutenant Colonel Ussa Park, commanding the 7th Rapid, landing zone at the garrison. "Garrison is sending us a survey map now. I want you on the perimeter, not inside. Inside, you're trapped if they breach. On the perimeter, you're mobile." "Temperature and wind." "You know what the temperature and wind are. You've been here 6 weeks. Park smiled. "Just wanted it on the record." "Noted. Anything else?" Nobody said anything. "Move." The Thunderhides went first. 90 metric tons of armored vehicle, moving through negative 114-degree cold and 200 km/h wind, and they moved. Not carefully, not slowly. They moved the way the Thunderhide was designed to move, which was at the full 60 km/h their drive systems allowed. Their thermal management systems cycling at maximum capacity, their tracks tearing through the methane ammonia ice surface and leaving trails that the wind began obliterating almost immediately. 2 cavalry units, 24 Thunderhides between them, flanked by a screen of lighter armored reconnaissance vehicles, pushing hard across the 40 kilometers of frozen nothing between Firebase Kestrel and Carindel, Maine. The artillery moved on its dedicated heavy-lift vehicles. The Helix platforms were not self-propelled over terrain like this. They needed their transports, and the transport drivers pushed those transports as hard as the vehicle governors allowed, which meant they were slower than the Thunderhides but moving. The infantry, the 6 ground assault battalions, were moving too, their armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles carrying them forward. Cold, dark, wind, ice, and the distant sound, carried on the gale, of something happening at the garrison that they couldn't quite hear but somehow knew was there. And above all of it, going up faster than anything on the surface, the F-91 Valkyries of TCA-3's air group clawing into the twilight sky of Carindel 7 and climbing. 24 fighters in total. They split into 2 formations, 8 going for orbital intercept, trying to get between the Julari descent vessels and their point of origin, 16 staying in the upper atmosphere where they could range across the whole battlefield, see everything, engage anything. The Julari, still descending, were watching this develop on their own sensors. The records that came out of the compact inquiry include the intercepted communications from the Julari Assault Fleet Commander during those early minutes. His name, in Julari phonology, doesn't translate neatly to any human language. The compact inquiry refers to him as Commander of the Assault, which was his rank title. What the records show is that he was, initially, not alarmed. He had been told the garrison was Velthari. He had been told the nearest backup was 11 hours away. He had planned accordingly. He had not been told about Firebase Kestrel. He had not been told about the humans. The first indication he had that something was different came when his sensor operators reported multiple armored ground vehicles moving at high speed from a ridge position 40 kilometers from the garrison. He asked for a classification. His sensor operator gave him the classification. He asked for a count. His sensor operator gave him the count. The records show a pause of approximately 12 seconds before the commander of the assault said anything else. Then he asked for confirmation of the vehicle type classification. Terran Markayek's Thunderhide main battle tanks. Confirmed. Back in the garrison, Thessaly Vorinaris was managing the controlled dissolution of everything she'd built in the past year. That's how she described it later, the controlled dissolution. She was not falling apart. She was not panicking. She was doing what a commander does when everything is going wrong and she knows it, and there's nothing she can do about the speed at which wrong is accumulating. She was making decisions. Small ones, medium ones, the kind that feel trivial when you're making them and enormous when you look back. Move the civilian technical staff to the inner facility. Not because it would necessarily help. If the Julari breached the outer perimeter, the inner facility bought hours, not salvation, but because they needed to be somewhere, and she needed them to feel like there was a plan. And having a place to be with an understanding of why you're going there is the closest thing to a plan that you can offer people in those circumstances. Get the communications relay up at full power and keep it up. If the compact was going to respond, if anyone was going to respond, she needed that relay functioning. Deploy her combat-rated personnel to the outer perimeter, 1,000 people more or less. Spread them across a perimeter designed for a garrison 3 times their number. She knew what that meant. They knew what it meant. Nobody said it out loud. Her deputy commander, a Vilthari named Sorrel with a calmness that Thessaly found either admirable or terrifying depending on the moment, brought her the first update on the Julari descent. Landing craft are beginning atmospheric entry. Estimate first ground contact in 31 minutes. How many in the first wave? Sensor count suggests 12 heavy landing craft. Each carries approximately 200 Julari assault infantry. 2,400 assault infantry, against 1,000 combat-rated garrison soldiers. What does the relay say? She asked. She kept asking. Sorrel checked. Compact relay has logged a response from Firebase Kestrel. She looked at him. Firebase Kestrel. Human installation. 3rd Combined Arms Brigade. She had known it was there. Abstractly. She had seen it on the deployment maps and thought about it the way you think about things that exist on maps. They're there, acknowledged, filed. She had never had particular cause to think about it as something that would matter to her specifically. What does their response say? Sorrel read it to her. Relay received. TCA-3 is mobile. All units committed. ETA to your position. 34 minutes on current drive. Air assets already airborne. We are coming. Hold what you can hold. She read it twice. Then she said, get me communication with their command. The communication established through the relay was fragmented. The wind interference on Carindel 7 was brutal for electromagnetic signals, and the relay infrastructure was already under intermittent electronic attack from Julari jamming efforts. But it was enough. Thessaly's voice came through with gaps and static, the particular rhythm of someone who has already spent an hour making impossible decisions and has arrived at a state beyond fear, something closer to absolute focus. General Chen. Commander Vorinaris. Chen was in her command vehicle, the armored command carrier rolling with the lead armor column. She had the communication set on speaker so Reeves could monitor and log. What's your perimeter situation? Outer perimeter is manned at approximately 30% of designed capacity. We have 12 Julari landing craft in descent. First ground contact in approximately 25 minutes by current estimate. My lead armor is 28 minutes from your position. I need you to hold the outer perimeter for 28 minutes. The line crackled. Commander. I understand, General. I need the outer perimeter intact. If they breach before I get there, I lose the tactical geometry and this gets harder. I understand. Your people can do this. 28 minutes. Another crackling pause. General, how many did you bring? All of them. The line was quiet for several seconds, not static quiet, quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone has received information that needs a moment to process. All of them, Thessaly said. Every unit in TCA-3, full combat load. The compact relay said you were the backup I assumed. She stopped, started again. I assumed a reaction force, a company perhaps, a battalion at maximum. Commander, I've been on this moon for 6 weeks with 3,800 soldiers and nothing to do. You called for backup. Chen paused, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite humor but lived near it. We sent everyone. Those 28 minutes. I've talked to Vilthari garrison soldiers who survived that night, and when I ask them about the 28 minutes, they go quiet in a particular way. Not the silence of someone who doesn't want to talk about it. The silence of someone who is still, years later, reconstructing how it felt. The Julari landing craft came down through the twilight of Carindel 7 in a pattern that suggested careful planning. They weren't crashing down all at once. They were staged, intentional, covering multiple approach vectors to the garrison perimeter so that the defenders couldn't concentrate at any single point. It was competent assault planning. It would have worked against the garrison alone, probably within the first hour. The garrison soldiers held their positions on the perimeter. They held them in the cold and the wind and the dark that wasn't quite dark, watching the landing craft come down, watching the Julari infantry begin their advance, and they held. 4 Vilthari soldiers were killed in the first contact. 6 more in the next 8 minutes. They held. Commander Vorinaris moved between positions on the perimeter herself, personally. She had a sidearm she wasn't sure she could use effectively. She was honest about this later. She said she'd been a desk officer for most of her career, and she wasn't certain her weapon-handling skills were equal to the situation. But she had her presence, and her voice, and her ability to look at a soldier who was beginning to lose their anchor and give them something to hold on to. She told them 28 minutes, then 23, then 18, then 14, then 10. She kept telling them the number because the number was getting smaller, and that meant something. 8 minutes. 5. 3. Then she heard it. Even over the wind, even over the weapon fire, even over the communication traffic crackling through her earpiece, and the sounds that a battle makes when it's happening close enough to feel in your chest. Even over all of that, she heard it. The sound of Terran Markayek's Thunderhide tanks arriving. She described it to me later, and she said, "You have to understand that the Thunderhide's drive system produces a harmonic vibration at full power that travels through the ground, through the ice, through the rock beneath the ice, at a frequency that the Vilthari acoustic sensory system perceives in a very particular way." She said it entered through the soles of her feet before she could hear it with her ears. She said the ground told her the humans were coming before anything else did. And then they crested the ridge. If you've seen the footage, and most people in the compact have seen the footage now, it's been replayed more times than I can count. You know what it looked like from the garrison's perspective. If you haven't, let me tell you. The ridge to the south-southwest of the Carindel garrison complex is not dramatic terrain by any standard. It's a long, gradual elevation rising maybe 40 meters above the plain, methane ammonia ice over silicate rock, featureless except for the way the wind has carved patterns into the surface over geological time. The Thunderhides came over that ridge in a line. Not a neat parade ground line, a fighting line, spread across nearly a kilometer of ridge frontage, the tanks moving in the controlled staggered formation that Terran armored cavalry uses when it's transitioning from movement to engagement, each vehicle offset from the ones beside it, the formation designed to maximize fields of fire, minimize mutual interference, keep everyone moving. 24 Thunderhides. Behind them, the armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, hundreds of them, the light infantry of 6 battalions packed into their transports and already beginning to debus, spilling out onto the ice in a disciplined, practiced rush, spreading out, taking positions. And above, the Valkyries, coming in from their orbital intercept and their upper atmosphere patrol, dropping into close support altitudes, the triple sonic cracks of their approach audible even through the wind. The Julari, assault infantry on the plain between the ridge and the garrison, had been engaged with the perimeter. They had been making progress. They had lost more soldiers than they'd expected against the garrison defenders, but they were making progress. They looked up. The Compact Inquiry has a translated record of Julari communications in those moments. I'll give you the relevant part. This is the communication from a Julari assault infantry field commander to the assault fleet. We are observing heavy armored contact, Terran classification, multiple columns. We are observing assault infantry debussing from armored carriers. We are observing atmospheric attack craft. We require clarification on the reinforcement schedule. The garrison backup was not. The communication breaks off. Colonel Hector Fuentes had been in armored cavalry for 22 years. He had fought in 3 major engagements before Carindel 7, and he had learned the same thing in all 3 of them. The moment of transition from movement to engagement is when you find out what your people actually are. Not in training, not in the long, boring weeks of preparation. In the first 30 seconds when the guns are cleared to fire and the distance closes and everything that has been theoretical becomes immediate and real. His people, the armored cavalry of TCA-3, were exceptional. The Thunderhides came off the ridge and they engaged without hesitation, main guns cycling. Each vehicle commander and gunner pair working together in the wordless rhythm of long practice, scanning, acquiring, engaging, moving to the next target, keeping the vehicle moving because a stationary Thunderhide is a target and a moving Thunderhide is a problem that keeps getting worse. The Julari assault infantry were Julari assault infantry. They were not unprepared, not undisciplined, not without their own weapons and tactics. They had anti-armor systems. They used them. The first Thunderhide hit took a direct penetrating strike from a Julari heavy plasma projector, and the tank's armor managed most of the energy. The crew was shaken, the forward sensor array was degraded, and the tank kept moving. That was the thing about the Thunderhide that the Julari hadn't accounted for. The Mark IX had been designed in the aftermath of the Wrestle conflict, specifically in response to encounters with compact-adjacent heavy weapon systems, and the armor package reflected the hard lessons of that conflict. It was not invincible, nothing is, but it was tolerant. It absorbed punishment and kept working. It kept moving. The Julari anti-armor teams that engaged the first tank expected it to stop. It didn't stop. It redirected its main gun at them, and the problem resolved itself. Fuentes was in the lead tank of the 1st Cavalry Unit, which was, technically, not where a colonel should be. He was supposed to be managing the battle, not fighting in it. He was doing both, managing his units through the command net while directing his own crew, and he did it well enough that nobody called him on it until much later when Mara Chen gave him a look that could have stripped paint and said, "If you'd gotten yourself killed, I would have been very irritated with you, Hector." And that was the end of that conversation. The armor rolled through the Julari assault positions on the plain, like a decision that had already been made. Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Danny Marsh. The infantry came in behind the armor. Lieutenant Colonel Danny Marsh commanded the 2nd Ground Assault Battalion, and her people were the first infantry elements to hit the plain. They debussed in the standard fashion, rear ramps dropping, fire teams spilling out, spreading wide, moving fast, the cold hitting them full in the face like a physical thing even through their suit insulation. -114 degrees. 200 km/h wind at ground level, slightly less in the shelter of the terrain features. Marsh's soldiers moved through it like it was inconvenient rather than lethal, because that's what 6 weeks of working, training, patrolling, and living on Carindel 7 had done to them. The cold was real and the wind was real, and they still moved. They moved through it in the practiced aggression of soldiers who have been waiting long enough that the waiting itself has become its own kind of pressure, and the release of that pressure into actual movement, actual purpose, is something that soldiers understand in a way that's hard to explain to people who aren't soldiers. They were glad to be moving. They were glad to have something to do. They pushed forward toward the garrison perimeter, linking up with the surviving defenders, integrating into the line. Marsh's radios were already coordinating with the garrison communications network. Reeves's signals regiment had done that work on the drive over, patching TCA-3's communications into the garrison's local net. So the handoff was clean and organized in ways that the garrison commanders had not expected. One of the garrison communications technicians later said that the moment TCA-3 hit their frequency and the command net lit up with organized human traffic, clear, disciplined, fast, everyone talking in the clipped shorthand of a unit that has trained together for years, that was when he understood that something had changed. Not just that backup had arrived, that the entire character of the battle had changed. The initiative had changed hands. The DHULARI commander reassessment. High above Carindel 7, in the command center of the assault fleet, the commander of the assault was doing something that Julari assault commanders are not, by doctrine or tradition, particularly inclined to do. He was reassessing. His sensor picture showed him things he had not anticipated. Armored columns engaging his assault infantry across a broad front. Air assets controlling the upper atmosphere and beginning to threaten his landing craft. 2 of his 12 landing craft had already been forced to abort their descent and retreat to higher altitude by the Terran fighters. Infantry forces linking up with the garrison defenders and reinforcing the perimeter. And behind all of that, behind the immediate fighting, he could see on his sensors the artillery units taking position. The Helix platforms coming off their transports, deploying, the fire control radars coming up. He knew what Helix platforms were. The Julari military had extensive files on Terran weapon systems. He knew the range. He knew the accuracy. He knew what 12 Helix platforms could do to a static assembly point or to a landing craft on the surface, and this was the part that his tactical systems were flagging insistently, to a Julari vessel in low orbital position. He asked his operations center to run a projection. If the Terrans completed their artillery deployment and began fire missions, what would his tactical situation look like in 40 minutes? His operations center gave him the projection. He stared at it for a very long time. He had 47 vessels. The siege carrier was his strategic reserve. But the smaller vessels, the destroyers, the assault transports, they were in positions that the Helix projection put inside the adjusted engagement envelope. He thought about the siege carrier. He had 3 kilometers of warship sitting in the orbital shadow of the gas giant. He could use it. He could bring it forward and render the conversation academic, overwhelm the Terran positions with firepower that nothing on the surface could absorb. He could do that. He began to think about what doing that would mean, not tactically, strategically, politically. The Terrans were a compact-aligned species, but they were not formally compact member species. Not yet. There had been negotiations. There had been discussions about formal treaty arrangements. There was, somewhere in the process of interstellar politics, a careful and delicate understanding that the Julari sovereignty and the Terran expeditionary force existed in a particular relationship to each other, not at war officially. Not yet. Engaging the TCA-3 with the siege carrier would answer a lot of questions about that relationship. He thought about those answers. He thought about them for 7 minutes, which was longer than he was accustomed to thinking about anything, because he was an assault commander and assault commanders were trained to act. Thinking was something you did before the engagement, not during it. But the situation was different now. General Chen, the artillery decision. On the surface, Mara Chen was watching her Helix batteries deploy and thinking about the siege carrier. She'd known it was there since the beginning. Her sensor picture had it clearly: 3 kilometers of Julari warship, sitting in the orbital shadow, watching. She had made the deliberate decision not to immediately address it, because you don't address a problem that isn't actively shooting at you when you have other problems that are. The Julari assault infantry on the plane was the problem that was actively shooting. Deal with that first. But the artillery was up now. The Helix platforms had deployed, taken their survey shots for positioning accuracy, run their own radar sweeps, and the fire control systems were showing her what she had known from the beginning. She could reach the destroyers. She could reach the assault transports. She could make the orbital positions significantly less comfortable for the Julari vessels currently hanging there. The question was the siege carrier. She couldn't reach it, not with Helix artillery, not at that range, not in that orbital position. And if she started engaging the smaller vessels and the commander of the assault decided to bring the siege carrier forward in response, she would have escalated a battle she was currently winning into something considerably worse. Her intelligence officer, Major Priya Sodo, appeared at her side in the command carrier and said, "Artillery is asking for targets, General." "I know. The fire control gives us good solutions on 6 of the smaller Julari vessels." "I know what it gives us." Soda waited. She was good at waiting, which was why she was an intelligence officer. Chen said, "If I fire on their vessels, does the siege carrier move?" "Unknown. Projection gives approximately 40% probability that the commander of the assault escalates if we engage his orbital assets." 40%. Give or take. It depends on whether he's assessed the political exposure of deploying the carrier against our forces. What's your estimate of his assessment? Soto thought about this carefully. She was precise about what she knew and what she was inferring, which was another reason she was good at her job. If he's a competent commander, and the assault planning suggests he is, he understands that engaging us directly with the carrier is a different category of action than engaging a Velthari garrison. We're Terran. We're in an associated status with the Compact. Destroying a TCA brigade is a political event, not just a tactical one. So he's thinking about it. I think he's been thinking about it since we came over that ridge. Chen drummed her fingers on the edge of the display. Once, twice, she stopped. I want the artillery batteries registered on the landing craft on the surface, not the orbital assets, the ones on the ground. Give the commander of the assault a choice between the surface assault and pulling his landing craft out. Don't make the orbital decision for him. Let him make it. Soda understood immediately. You're giving him an exit. I'm giving him a choice that doesn't require him to explain a dead Terran brigade to his government. She picked up her command radio. Fuentes, Marsh, update. Fuentes came back. We've pushed them off the northwestern quadrant. They're pulling back toward their landing craft on the eastern plain. We can cut off their retreat to the craft if you want cavalry around the southern approach. Infantry push from the north. Chen said, "Can you do it without getting anybody killed doing something stupid?" "I can do it without getting anybody killed doing something stupid." "Do it." The armored cavalry swept south and came up around the eastern plain in a wide arc that the Julari assault infantry, focused on their fighting withdrawal, did not see until it was already positioned. 24 thunderhides between the assault infantry and their landing craft. 24 main guns cleared and registered. And behind those guns, the 12 Helix platforms walked fire into the landing craft positions on the eastern plain. Not the craft themselves. Chen had been precise about this. She wanted them damaged, not destroyed. She wanted the option to leave open, but the positions around them. The weapon systems deployed near them. The defensive lines they'd been establishing around the craft. The landing craft were suddenly much less comfortable as rallying points. The Julari assault infantry, caught between the armored cavalry behind them and the infantry pressing from the perimeter, found themselves in a position that had, in the past 20 minutes, transformed from a successful assault into an encirclement. The garrison perimeter was holding. More than holding, it was advancing, as the TCA-3 infantry pushed the line outward, recovering ground that had been given up in the first contact minutes. Above, the Valkyries were running intercept patterns that had grounded every remaining Julari landing craft. Nothing was going up. Nothing was coming down. The orbital assets were frozen. In the command center of the Julari assault fleet, the commander of the assault was watching all of this happen. He made his decision. The communication that went out on the Julari command frequency, intercepted and logged by TCA-3's signals regiment, translated roughly to: all surface elements are to break contact and return to designated extraction points. Landing craft are to execute extraction on my command. Assault operation is suspended pending strategic reassessment. Suspended pending strategic reassessment. The extraction took 3 hours. Chen let it happen. She pulled the armored cavalry back from the encirclement enough to give the Julari infantry access to the landing craft, but she kept the Helix batteries registered on the extraction zone and kept the Valkyries overhead. She kept Fuentes' armor between the garrison perimeter and the extraction zone so that the withdrawal went only in one direction, and no one was confused about that. The garrison soldiers, the Velthari who had held the perimeter for 28 minutes and who had watched the cavalry arrive over the ridge. Some of them were standing on the perimeter wall now, watching the Julari extraction with an expression that Thessaly later described as stunned wonder, like people who had been braced for an ending and instead found themselves watching a different story unfold. Thessaly herself came out of the garrison to meet Chen. This part I have from both of them. Thessaly told me her version and Chen told me hers, and they align closely enough that I trust them. They met near the gate of the outer perimeter, in the twilight and the wind, and Thessaly, who was taller than Chen by about 30 centimeters, because Velthari are generally tall people, looked at this compact, still, silver-haired Terran general and said, "You brought everyone." Chen said, "You called for backup." I don't know what I expected. I didn't expect." She stopped, started again. "How did you move that fast? How did you get all of them moving in 20 minutes? 6 weeks of waiting. My people were very ready to move." The wind hit them both, and they stood in it, and Thessaly said, "The Julari commander, he had a siege carrier. He chose not to use it. He made a smart choice." "Why he could have?" "Because he's not stupid," Chen said. "He ran the math. We sent a brigade. If he destroyed a Terran brigade, he wouldn't be having a strategic reassessment. He'd be starting a war. A different kind of war. One his government probably didn't authorize when they sent him out here." Thessaly was quiet for a moment. "Did you know that, when you came, did you know he wouldn't use it?" Chen looked at her steadily. "No. But you came anyway. You called for backup. I want to tell you what happened with the siege carrier, because it matters." For 4 days after the battle, it stayed in the orbital shadow of the gas giant. The Julari surface forces had extracted. The assault fleet's smaller vessels had pulled back to a holding position, but the siege carrier stayed. During those 4 days, Chen kept TCA-3 deployed at the garrison. Her artillery batteries remained in their fire positions. Her fighters maintained their patrol schedules. Her armor stayed forward. And for those 4 days, the compact relay was busy. Ambassadors, envoys, political officers. The Julari sovereignty and the compact directorate exchanged messages at a volume that someone on the relay monitoring staff later described as the busiest 4 days in the relay's operational history. The siege carrier left on the 5th day. It went without firing a shot. It took the assault fleet with it, and it went back across the Carindal Passage, back through the Vethric Nebula, back to wherever the Julari sovereignty based its siege-class assets, and it did not come back. The Compact Directorate reached an agreement with the Julari sovereignty about Carindel 7 and the Carindel Passage within 3 months. The terms were not made entirely public, but the operational result was clear. The passage remained open. The garrison remained compact. There are historians who argue about how much of that outcome was the diplomacy and how much was the brigade. I think they're looking at it wrong. I think it was both. I think the brigade made the diplomacy possible by changing the commander of the assault's calculation on that first night, and the diplomacy converted the change in calculation into something lasting. You need both. You always need both. But you need the brigade first. Here's something I want to tell you about the Velthari garrison soldiers. They held for 28 minutes against 2,400 Julari assault infantry with 1,000 combat-rated people on a perimeter designed for 3 times that number. They held it. 10 soldiers were killed in those 28 minutes. 23 were wounded. And the 967 who came through it carried something out of that night that I think is worth talking about. The Velthari are not, as I said, a martial species. After Carindel 7, there were conversations in the Velthari Compact Assembly about whether their garrison forces were appropriately configured, appropriately trained, appropriately prepared for the kind of operational reality that the passage position created. Those conversations led to changes. But the thing I keep thinking about is simpler than institutional change. I spoke to a garrison soldier named Yethais. He was one of the communications technicians, not even combat-rated, and he'd been at one of the perimeter sensor stations when the Julari made initial contact. He'd been there because the station was undermanned and Voronarus had asked for volunteers from any available personnel. He told me that when the Thunderhides came over the ridge, he had been at that position for 22 minutes and he had fired a weapon 5 times, which was 4 more times than he'd ever fired one in his life before that. He said he didn't know if he'd hit anything. He said he'd been focused on not running. He said the sound the Thunderhides made coming over the ridge, that ground harmonic the Velthari sensory system picks up through the feet before the ears. He said it was the best thing he had ever felt. He said he started crying. Not dramatically, just tears running into his face wrap in the cold, and he wasn't embarrassed about it because everyone around him had the same reaction or something close to it. He said they didn't have to come. Do you understand what I mean? There was no treaty that required them to come. There was no compact directive. There was a distress signal and they came, all of them. I said I understood. He said, I don't think I did before that night. I don't think I understood what that meant about them, what it says about who they are. The human soldiers of TCA-3 had their own experience of that night, and I want to be fair to it. 22 soldiers from TCA-3 were killed in the battle on Carindel 7. 51 were wounded, of which 8 required medical evacuation and long-term care. The Markaix Thunderhides took significant damage to 3 vehicles, with 1 total loss when a Julari heavy plasma projector found the rear armor at an angle the design hadn't accounted for. The crew survived, but barely. These are not abstractions. These are people who went over a ridge into a battle they weren't ordered into because their general decided that a distress call was sufficient reason to move, and some of them didn't come back. I want to be careful not to make this triumphant in a way that erases them. Chen visited every casualty before she wrote the official after-action report. That's something she did, she told me, as a practice she'd maintained across every engagement she'd commanded. She said it wasn't about guilt. She was clear on that. She wasn't interested in performing guilt as a substitute for genuine accountability. It was about knowing, making sure she looked at the specific weight of the decision she'd made. She said the decision was still correct. She said that twice, so that I understood she wasn't hedging. She said 22 people, against a garrison that would have been overrun, against a passage that would have been lost, against a precedent that would have been set for what happens when a Julari assault fleet meets no effective resistance. She paused. The math is not comfortable, but it's the math. I asked her if she'd been afraid that night, when she sent everyone. She said, I was afraid the whole drive over. What were you going to do about it? Stop. Word spread, of course it did. In a galaxy with an active communications, relay network and dozens of species watching the political situation around the Carindel Passage, a battle where the Velthari sent a distress call, and a human brigade responded in 20 minutes, crossed 40 kilometers of frozen hell, and changed the tactical situation before the compact had finished typing its standby message that was not going to remain quiet. The debates that erupted in the compact directorate, in the various compact-adjacent governments, in the military planning bodies of half a dozen species. They ranged from admiring to alarmed, and the division of opinion didn't always fall where you'd expect. Some species were alarmed not at the Julari but at the humans, the speed of response, the scale of the commitment. The fact that a Terran general had made the decision to commit her entire brigade without waiting for compact authorization, without confirmation, without a command hierarchy blessing. One delegate to the compact directorate, I won't name the species because it would be politically uncomfortable, described Chen's decision as unilateral military action of a kind that sets a concerning precedent. Chen, when this was relayed to her, said, I was 40 kilometers away and they needed help. What precedent should I have been concerned about instead? She was not, technically, disciplined for the decision. The outcome made disciplining her difficult politically. What she received instead was a formal commendation from the Velthari government, a somewhat more ambiguous acknowledgement from the compact directorate, and a message from Terran High Command that said, in the particular bureaucratic language that military commendations use, essentially, well done. Please don't make us deal with this level of diplomatic complexity again. Other species had a different reaction entirely. The Krethian Field Medical Corps sent a formal communication to the Terran Expeditionary Force, requesting information about TCA-3's rapid deployment protocols. Not because they had any intention of doing what TCA-3 had done. The Krethians were medics, not assault infantry, but because the question of how you move 3,800 people in 20 minutes was apparently interesting to people who thought professionally about logistical problems. The Terranese artillery cohort sent what translated roughly as a professional appreciation, which was, Mara Chen told me later, the nicest thing she'd ever been sent by anyone who didn't have to be nice to her. And from across the compact, from garrison commanders and frontier installation officers, and the people who lived and worked in the places that tended to be forgotten until they suddenly mattered, from all of them, the message was the same. If we send the distress call, will you come? 6 months after the battle, I visited Carindel 7. The garrison had been reinforced. The compact directorate had, in the aftermath of the very public near loss of the passage, found the political will to address the staffing deficit that had put 4,000 logistics-heavy Velthari in a position designed for 12,000 combat-ready soldiers. The reinforced garrison was mixed species, better armed, properly configured for the defensive requirements of the position. Firebase Kestrel was gone. The 3rd Combined Arms Brigade had been reassigned, compact politics and logistical rotation, the normal machinery of military positioning. They were somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't allowed to know the specifics of, being whatever they were. The ridge they'd come over was still there, obviously. The ridge didn't care about any of this. It was 40 meters of methane ammonia ice over silicate rock, same as it had been for 6 billion years, and it would be there long after everyone in this story was gone. But on the garrison side of that ridge, someone had put a marker. It wasn't official. The garrison commander told me, when I asked about it, that nobody knew exactly who had placed it first. He thought it might have been Yethais, the communications technician who'd cried when the Thunderhides came over the ridge, or one of the other garrison survivors. It had appeared one morning, and nobody had asked about its origin because by the time anyone noticed it, it already felt like it had always been there. It was a flat piece of silicate rock, placed upright, and on it someone had scratched words in 3 languages: Velthari phonetic script, standard compact, and Terran English. The Velthari phonetic script said something that translates approximately to, "On this ground when we called, they came." The standard compact said, "Carindle 7, the night the humans sent everyone." The English said, "TCA 3, we heard you, we moved." I've been trying to figure out what to make of all this. Not just the battle, not just the politics, the thing underneath all of it. The reason Yethais cried and the reason Chen said, "What were you going to do about it? Stop." And the reason the siege carrier left without firing a shot. I think it's this. There's a quality in some entities, some individuals, some groups, some species that expresses itself only when the situation demands it, and you can't know it's there until the demand is made. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with warning labels. It sits inside, quiet and still, and when the moment is right, it moves. The Velthari garrison found it, on that perimeter, holding for 28 minutes with inadequate numbers in brutal conditions, against a force that should have overwhelmed them. They found something in themselves they hadn't known was there. And the humans. Look, I'm trying not to be dramatic about this. I'm aware of how it sounds from the outside when you start making large claims about what a species is and what it means. I'm aware of how those claims can become cartoonish if you push them too hard. But I sat in a hospital room with Thessaly Vorinaris, and I watched her talk about that night, and I saw what it had done to her understanding of things. And I've read the inquiry transcripts and the diplomatic records and the military analyses, and I keep coming back to something simple. They called for backup. They said, "We need help. We'll take anything you can send, please hurry." And somewhere 40 kilometers away, in a frozen firebase on a frozen moon, a general with 31 years of experience and 3,800 soldiers behind her heard the call and made a decision in 15 minutes that involved sending every single one of them. Not a reaction force. Not a carefully proportioned response. Everyone, everything, because someone called and they heard and moving was the answer. That's not ordinary. I don't know if it's unique. I don't know what humanity is versus what humanity could become, or what any species is versus what the situation makes them. I'm not qualified for those claims. But I know what happened on Carindle 7. And I know that the marker on the ridge isn't going anywhere. The wind carves the ice around it, and the methane ammonia surface breathes in and out with the tidal pull of the gas giant, and the twilight that never quite becomes day or night goes on and on and on. And the marker stays. On this ground when we called, they came. Ending line. There's a question that gets asked in the compact and outside it whenever Carindle 7 comes up in conversation. The question is, why? Why send everyone? Why not calculate the appropriate response, the proportional commitment, the tactically sufficient force? Chen's answer, the one that's in the official record, is the tactical one. Because she didn't have time for anything less than everything. Because a partial response that arrived too late was worse than a full response that changed the situation. But there's another answer. The one she gave me, not for the record, in a quiet corridor of Vithos Station 3 months after the battle, when I asked her what she'd actually been thinking in those 15 minutes in the command tent. She said they asked for help. That's it. That was her complete answer. She looked at me like it should be sufficient, like anything more complicated was unnecessary ornamentation on something straightforwardly simple. They asked for help. So they sent everything they had. And the galaxy has been trying to figure out what to do with that answer ever since.